Pastor will join us in just a bit, she said. Okay, so in spite of the title of this handout, this is not a strict definition. This is not like, just so you all know, this is what faith is. It's not that. This is more about looking at the nature of faith. And so we're going to look at a few things, and some of this stuff I'm going to burn through quickly and only highlight a few things. The rest of it is for you to read at your leisure. These are some things from some authors that make some really good points that are worth now. And then we're going to end with a couple of popular examples. One from a movie called The Grand Budapest Hotel, and then something from Harry Potter, which I think that these two examples are two of the most really distinct and fascinating examples of faith that can be found in popular genre media. And so I highlight them. Now, I said last week that if you're not familiar with Harry Potter, I'm about to ruin it for you. So hopefully you guys are familiar enough. Most people said last week it was okay. I think Candy said she was like, it's okay, you can ruin it for me. So anyway, we can just skip the first page, except to look at Paul's Hebrews. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. Historically, it's been attested to Paul, but actually very early on in the church it was uncertain, and then it kind of got lumped in with Pauline epistles, and then finally we came back around to going, actually we have no idea who wrote it. But faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. That's interesting, kind of. I mean, it's all right, but it's, I think, still a little vague, especially in the way that faith gets used around the rest of the New Testament. But that's one space where it's addressed very specifically. Now, I think there are problems with how we conceive of faith, at least popularly. We're going to come back around here in just a moment, but one of the things that happens is that we pit faith against works, right? This happens a lot. People talk a lot about the Pauline letters versus James, who says, well, faith without works is dead, right? And they say, well, Paul has a very different picture. Well, I mean, maybe, but Paul also says, he's like faith, justification by faith, faith. And then he says later, faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these is love. So are they really that different? So, but faith alone, as like, this is the main thing, just faith alone. This becomes a really prominent doctrinal concept. Sola fide, it's very important, and people really, really hit that point hard when they talk about religious life, and nobody hits it harder than atheists. So we should have a response if we're people who profess some belief. We should have a response to this idea that faith alone is the highest value. Well, okay. In fact, many modernists, atheists, and people, I hesitate to just say scientists, which I did in here, but actually let's say materialist.
But my biology teacher in college would say there's no conflict between religion and science,
right?
Because it's based on faith. Well, because they don't use the word faith.
Right. But see, even that still presents it as a dichotomy. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a really cheap, poor understanding. Mm-hmm. And many people denigrate faith as little more than blissful ignorance. Like, just here's a proposition, believe it or don't. If you believe in it, good. But here we go. So in fact, in dictionary.com, definition 2 says that faith is a belief that is not based on proof. And Karl Marx called religion the opiate of the masses. This is a common sentiment. but it's that people use faith primarily as a psychological means of comfort and false security. And one of the authors I'll quote later, has something to say about that. But there's another view that Alexis de Tocqueville said. He says, religion is only a particular form of hope, and it is as natural to the human heart as hope itself. Only by a kind of aberration of the intellect and with the aid of some sort of moral violence exercised on their own nature do men stray from religious belief. An invincible inclination leads them back to religion. Disbelief is the accident. Faith alone is the permanent state of humanity. And in fact, as much as people are at each other, you mentioned people being kind of at each other's throats a lot lately, one of the things that you'll notice, and one of the things that a lot of social commentators have observed, is that in our increasingly secular society, many things that, certainly in the minds of the people who hold those views, are just self-evident. Even if you want to say that they're philosophically justifiable and lay out a case, one of the things that some people have observed is that in any case, these things are filling the void that religion has left in a secular society, right? There are a lot of what has replaced religion in the minds of many people, it's argued, is ideology of some kind or another, and so I think that when we talk about religion and when we talk about faith, we need to number one, we need to ask a question about what is the nature of faith, and number two, we need to broaden the scope of what that encompasses, because it's not just religion. A lot of people you ask, you'll say, well, I mean, what do you think we'll talk about this a little bit later about values. People will say, well, I just think that da-da-da-da. You go, why? And they go, well, I mean, is it obvious? Somehow, a lot of people walk around with religious beliefs they can't justify, and a lot of people walk around with social ideologies that they are no better at justifying than your average religious person. And yet they think they're not religious because they live in a society that many of whom share their beliefs, and so it seems self-evident. And they think they live in a secular society because they don't live in a theistic culture necessarily. They don't have a theistic belief. Well, Buddhism isn't theistic either, but it's a religion, right? So I think that we need to be a lot more careful about how we even conceive of these terms, because they're much more fluid, and sometimes things fill a space that we think we're not, like we're just like, oh, I don't even know quite how to say this. Sometimes lacking a tool, we put something else in its place, right? But unfortunately, many religious people have also accepted this definition of faith as just a belief you hold without evidence or proof. And then they've taken that to be a virtue, right? So that some kind of categorical blind trust is a virtue, and they've used the Doubting Thomas story to substantiate this, and I think that's unfortunate, because after the resurrection, Thomas, one of the 12 disciples, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side," the stab wound from the spear. "Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus told him, "Because you've seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." And that sounds like, for those people who believed even without some evidence or proof, they're the ones who did the right thing. But I think that is desperately lacking in context from other things other things Jesus said. So first, I'm going to point out that let's take the most obvious thing before we even come back to that story. Jesus was a rabbi. What is a rabbi?
Teacher.
A teacher. Teachers are not usually against learning. They're not against reasoning. Talk particularly Jewish rabbi, like Jewish teachers, right? They're all about. I mean, it says in the Bible, "Come, let us reason together."
Unless you live in Florida.
Yeah.
Unless there's a very strong, you know, dialogical aspect to rabbinic,
Yeah.
you know, to rabbinic teaching.
They're all about the question.
They're all about the questions. They're all about, you know, I mean, Jesus was found in the temple talking with other men and in discourse, right, when he was 12, according to the story. So, and it was actually a persistent point of frustration, particularly in the Gospel of Mark, with Jesus, that his disciples didn't understand. So he wanted them to understand. And also, I mean, what is the word? I mean, these are disciples. They want to learn, right? They attach themselves to a rabbi because they want to learn and understand. So it's unlikely that Jesus ever said something that meant, you know, you don't need proof or even understanding, just blind faith.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous, number one. So my
That's a
proposition.
really good point.
What's that?
That's a very good point.
Thank you. So,
Really, because, you know, there's nowhere does it say that.
yeah, it's,
In there.
yeah. Well, and so
Blessed are those, but they're no better.
but why are they blessed? And we're going to come to this in just a second. Yeah. So my proposition is that it is a tired and possibly sick mind that wants credit for ignorance. And it is a foolish suggestion that a teacher of any worth would encourage ignorance in disciples. And any view that espouses it should seriously be reconsidered. So first, let's ask the question of, is there a difference between evidence and proof? Right?
I don't think so.
Well, there might be.
Yes, I think there is.
Because I mean, like, my favorite kind of shows are the BBC and all the mystery and detective and courtroom dramas.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a lot of evidence, but it might not prove what you're looking for.
Right.
Right. Even in the court system.
Prove your spouse loves you. Prove it.
Yeah.
What's the evidence?
Well, evidence can prove it.
Well-
If you had a list of evidence.
Well-
that-
But you could have opposing evidence.
You could have opposing evidence.
Right,
Uh-huh.
right.
You can have all sorts of evidence.
That's called court, you know.
Well, and that's an interesting, when you say court, it's fine. People will say there's no evidence of, you know, like, okay, well, the New Testament has people saying this and that happened. That's testimony, right? And they go, that's not evidence. And we're like, you could argue it's weak evidence. People have argued that court testimonies and things like that are weak, are the weakest of kind of evidence. But it's not evidence. It's just, you know,
Like in court, they would say,
Yeah.
the evidence will prove.
the evidence will prove,
The evidence will prove that my client is innocent.
right, and they will
Or
have,
guilty. Or
but
whatever.
it's very rare. But so there's the evidence leads to a point that you could then potentially call proof.
Well,
Right.
there has been trials that we're all aware of, that there was a lot of evidence, and the jury.
Said they failed to prove it.
Yeah.
The evidence might suggest. Evidence can suggest, but it might
Beyond
not
a
prove.
reasonable doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. So there are
That's
these
the key word,
degrees.
beyond
Exactly.
reasonable doubt.
Exactly.
Is it
So,
material evidence or
or is it
eyewitness?
eyewitness
Or a
testimony?
hearsay.
Eyewitness testimony gets us back to the New Testament. It might be, and that people have said for years that eyewitness testimony is the weakest kind of evidence, but we still accept it as relevant at least, right? And so this is, you know, these are things, so when somebody says there's no evidence or proof, you're like, I grant you, we might not have proof. That does not mean there's zero evidence, and that's important.
That makes sense.
So anyway,
With this section, I'm sorry, I've done a great job, I think, of keeping my mouth shut, but I don't. Last night, I did watch parts of the Ten Commandments,
oh yeah,
okay, and it's like all this proof that there's a Lord, you know,
I know.
because
yes,
the water
Yes.
opened up and the river opened and this happened and this happened.
yes.
Moses came down from the mountain, you know.
This is exactly. I was about to say this, and I'll say it now.
I beat
Actually,
you to the punch.
this is something. No, thank you. This is an important thing because at some point between pastors or whatever, and I was doing a lay sermon. One of the things that I highlighted was that the Bible is not actually that interested in blind credulity. It's not terribly interested in just, say the creed, here's a proposition, say you believe it, and you're good. The Bible is actually a very empirical document because it's always saying, have you not seen? Have you not heard? Were you not there? And there are two things that Jesus says that again, put this in a kind of context. Number one, he says, when it is evening, you say, it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it'll be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. He's saying, like, how can you be so, how can you so easily observe this and that and the other, but you can't see what's going on when it's right in front of your face? He also then says, in keeping with this whole idea of, were you not there? Did you not see? Have you not witnessed this? He even says, foreshadowing his own death and resurrection. He tells the parable of Lazarus and, is it Dives? Is that the name that history gives him? I can't remember whether it's in the story. Dives, like Lazarus and Dives. The Lazarus and the rich man. They both die. The rich man has ignored Lazarus at his footstool. Yeah, because that's the question. Were they the same person?
Nah.
Hard to say. I don't know.
Like Smith,
What's that? Like
Might
Smith?
have been like Smith. Maybe it was
Lazarus is also, I think it's short for Eleazar.
Oh,
I think it's short for that.
There's probably.
So probably more than one. But
Yes, he was the poor man up in heaven.
yeah, well, not. They're
Even
actually in Sheol, but they're not in the same
They're
condition.
not in the same realm.
Yeah,
One is suffering and
one is suffering,
eating
and the other one
food.
is
Eating
doing well. Is in Abraham's bosom, whatever that means, right?
Use of the word realm.
Right. Yeah. And so anyway, which actually comes from royaume in French. It means kingdom.
Realm.
Yeah. It means for
It's a good inclusive word.
yeah.
UCC, I noticed, uses the word kingdom, and I'm like,
So anyway, he tells this parable about Lazarus and the rich man, and the rich man has routinely ignored this poor sick Lazarus who's at his doorstep all the time. And then they both die, and Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom. Exactly what that means, it's a bigger question. But the rich man is not in a great state, and he's like, this is no good. I don't like this. Why? But he sees this gulf between him and Lazarus, and he's like, what is, like, he's like, why is, and then there's a question of, like, the rich man says, can you go and tell my relatives about this so that they don't make the same mistake? And Jesus says in the mouth of is it Lazarus who's speaking? Or is
I
it
think it's the narrator of the parable.
maybe the
I
yeah?
can't remember.
But Jesus says, he goes, they have had Moses and they have had the prophets.
Yeah.
And then he says, even if a man were to come back from the dead, even if Lazarus were to come back from the dead and tell him, like, hey, here's what he says, even if a man were to come back from the dead, they won't believe. He says this again, foreshadowing his own death and resurrection.
And it kind of seems like there's a contemporary thing, even though people are giving facts and truth, they're not going to believe it.
Well, it's basically, it makes this question of faith and belief, and it's a much more fluid and much more complicated concept than just being so black or white. But so anyway, but back to the story with Thomas. So we revisit this again now in light of Jesus sort of saying, like, you see all these things, but you don't understand, right? He's like, even if a dead man came back, some people are just not going to. And it's worth noting that at the appearances of Jesus, some still disbelieved. Not Thomas. Thomas saw him. He had the appearance. He wouldn't believe it just at the word. That's true. At their words that we've seen him. He's like, whatever. He then did believe when he saw Jesus, but there were some, and we don't talk about this very much, but at one of the appearances, it says, still there were some who disbelieved, even people who saw him, right? So look back at this. He says, put your finger here. Da, 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 da. He says, and Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed.
Okay.
But blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed.
Do you know who my dad is?
I'm right here.
Oh. My mom?
She could be. She's in the sanctuary practicing music. So all of the disciples were distraught at Jesus' death, and they thought all was lost. But when they were told of his resurrection, all but Thomas immediately believed. Why? How does faith really factor into the appearances? All of them, not just Thomas, who needed to see with his own eyes, were eventually visited by the risen Jesus. So what's the difference as far as faith is concerned? They would all eventually see him. The most believing were not left out because their faith in his resurrection was sufficient. Sorry, what did I
I
write?
didn't see her there.
Well, then you haven't found her. Keep looking.
Maybe she's outside.
Well, by
No, don't go outside.
No.
Don't go outside. Hey, Laura, don't go outside.
No,
She's not outside.
maybe she's up in the attic.
Maybe she's by the food.
So,
Yeah.
in terms of who was going to see Jesus, in terms of, like, all of them did. So, what is this blessing? Is it possible that the disciples who heard and believed were comforted, while Thomas was left in doubt, grieving and mourning and fearing? Maybe the blessedness, maybe this story is actually a story not about a guy who should have just believed in spite of zero evidence, zero proof. Maybe this is a story about a person who didn't understand. And that the blessedness is that they understood, as soon as they heard about it, they were like, yes, he said this would happen. And what is really unfortunate about Thomas, the doubting Thomas story, is not about a person who should have just held an ignorant belief in his head, but actually it's a person who should have been expecting the resurrection the whole time.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like the blessedness is their understanding. It's
And they're
putting
comforting.
the evidence together or
Yeah.
connecting the dots and hindsight and recalling what Jesus had said in the past. Oh, now it's making some sense why he said this or that.
So I'm going to take a look at this question.
Anywhere, Dada.
Well, then just play with the boys. Go play with the boys. Mom will find you. Okay?
No sign of her anywhere.
I
So
think it's a bathroom
Have faith,
break.
Laura.
have faith.
Yeah, that's not-
She's somewhere.
A
Okay.
bathroom break.
Anyway, so let's take a look at these words really quick before we wrap up with the authors.
No.
No,
Oh,
Yes.
I think she is.
she did.
Uh-huh.
It sounded like
Yes,
her.
yes,
Sounds like she's out there.
yes. I heard the door and then I heard her, so.
I worry about fingers getting stuck indoors.
I worry about her being in the next county,
Hitchhiking? Tormenting someone?
running.
Yeah.
But not when she's with her brothers, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
like even when the boys were little, I always told them, you travel with someone else, you always have a partner.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's take a look. So we have an idea of justice. Okay, like what is the image of justice?
Balancing.
Balanced scales, right? Fairness. That's not what this word means. Okay? The word just and the word righteous are translations of the same word. The word justice from Latin actually comes to us, it's still in use in some of the Latin languages. Like if it's French, they'll say c'est juste or ce n'est pas juste. Or in Italian, there's stories about singer Cecilia Bartoli, whose mother taught her to sing. From the other room, she would hear her do something. She'd go, Cecilia, non è giusto, right? So she's like, and what it means is that's not right. It's not right. So the idea of justice has to do with right. We even still use this in word processing. We'll say, how would you like to justify this?
That's right.
What would be correct? Justify it left, justify it right. How is it that you want this? How is it? And it's important to remember that this is not, this is a teleological term. Because if you say, from here, I'm going to Seattle, you're like, oh, which way are you taking? You're like, oh, I'm going to take the eastward route. You're like, okay, that is not a road that will get you there. You're like, don't tell me what's right. You're like, what you're doing and whether it's right or wrong depends entirely on what your aims are, right? If you are, and so the question of what is right is directly tied to God's will. So, if you have two children and one of them hits the other, fairness dictates the other one gets to hit them back. But that is not right. And you would not say, well, go ahead, hit them back, right? If you want what love or what, if you want God's will, whatever, it's not always fairness. It's not always equality in all terms, right? So you have to be more discerning than that. We have to say that justice means what is right, which may be what is fair.
I cannot
Right.
tell you how many fights I adjudicated in my classroom.
Right, I'm sure.
In my classroom, because my students insisted
Right.
It was fair.
that if
Fairness.
somebody hits you, you can
Exactly.
hit them back. And they were taught that at home.
Well, that's also not unreasonable. I have long maintained, and this is my read on it, but I've long maintained that if you're living in a time where somebody stealing your cow means you murder their whole family, then eye for an eye is a step in the right direction,
True.
right? This
Balance.
makes a difference. But you take that further. You start by saying, consider each other enough to not go further than what is fair. But then at some point it changes over. The eye for an eye evolves into the golden rule, right? That it evolves into, Jesus looking from the cross like a parent to his children who are murdering him, literally murdering him, and saying, I won't hurt you. I won't call down God's wrath on you. I won't even wish ill on you. I'm going to actually pray for your forgiveness. Praying forgiveness for the people who are actively killing you, right?
And that's what Jesus did.
Right. It's not
On the cross.
fair. It's
Yeah,
not fair, right? So, now faith, getting back to how this is relevant. Because people will say this famous phrase, because this is the word pistis for faith, but it translates a number of different ways. So people will use this word, justification by, or this phrase, justification by faith. This is a phrase that kind of arises in the New Testament, this idea of justification by faith. But if by this you mean like a creed or belief in a proposition, propositional belief, then justification sounds something like you are declared, so justification or righteousness, declared righteous or declared correct.
I have a memorial service
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, for
for Joe Stahl
Yeah.
Day.
Okay. Well, it'll all be on here, on the video.
Thank you.
It starts to sound desperately like you will be declared correct for having believed this proposition. Like, well, I believe thus and so. And you're like, well, I believe thus and so. And somebody goes, he was right. And you go, yay, right? I win. And the problem is that justification and faith means belief. It also means, faith gets turned from pistis in Latin into fide. What does that give us?
Fidelity.
Fidelity. Fidelity is not belief. Fidelity is more an investment. So you could translate justification by faith or righteousness by faith, but you can also translate this, and this is one translation, this is one read, and it's one that I think is valuable, but other people would say that it could be different. But I think you can just as easily say that you are made, like justified right? You are justified, like justify left,
Made
justify right, doing what is right, doing what's right. You are made right. You are justified. You are made right by fidelity. Right? That is not the same thing as maintaining a belief, maintaining a proposition, and then being declared a winner for holding that belief. But in fact, then if you are corrected, there's this idea in the Eastern Church of theosis, growing to be more and more like God. Like, remember that thing that I said, that he reaches out, becoming like us, we might reach out spiritually back? That we are improved, we are made, that theosis happens, that we are made right by our fidelity to things. That brings in not just a creedal religion, creedal approach, but actually fidelity to, it brings in Jesus' ministry. It combines Paul and James's message. That yes, faith matters. Pistis matters. Pistis matters a lot. Pistis matters. And faith without works is dead. Right? It's a little, so let's move on to these authors and then.
Because one of the things you're gonna get into is the idea of grace.
Well, I think that, I'll leave that to you in the coming week. But yeah, so.
Because some people, if you don't have enough, if people feel like they're not, quote, saved or made right with God, because I don't have the right faith or enough, that's where the grace comes in.
Right. Well, there's, people talk about having a parent who would I could never do anything right, and every time I did something wrong, I was horribly punished. Grace is the space for you the space given for you to do this, for you to make these efforts, even your failures, right? But, so, faith is more than merely a belief minus evidence. John Dominic Crossan, a biblical scholar, says that if you looked at the world in which Jesus and Paul lived, and you ask yourself, did those people read those texts? Did they take it literally or metaphorically? He says, I do not have the faintest idea, is the honest answer. And honestly, it's probably a bit of a mixture. He says, but I do know they took it operationally, they took it functionally, they took it programmatically. To say I believe in the divinity of Caesar meant I'm getting with the program. I'm supporting Roman imperialism. And that means if you say Jesus is Lord, you've just committed treason, right? So faith is also a larger personal investment in a worldview. And secular humanism, I might point out, is a worldview. I mean, if you say the equal value of all human beings because blah, 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 that is not a scientifically verifiable thing. In fact, science would suggest that we're all terribly unequal. I am not Michael Jordan. I am not Michael Jordan, and I'm not the nicest person in the world. I'm not the meanest person in the world. There are people out there who have all sorts of illnesses, and there are people out there who've never been sick a day in their life. We are desperately unequal in all sorts of measures, but secular humanism bases this idea. They say, well, but we're all of equal value. Okay, where'd you get that? Right? Okay. Now, next page. Terry Eagleton is an atheist, communist, literary critic, and he called out the prominent atheists of the last 15, 20 years in a book where he said, basically saying, look, I'm not saying I disagree with you guys. I'm not saying that you guys are wrong about atheism or even some of the problems that religion has caused, but I do think you guys are wildly ignorant of the subject and you're actually making stupid arguments. And so he said, there's probably no greater evidence of the new atheists' theological illiteracy than the fact that they seem to, and they persistently subscribe to what one might call the Bigfoot belief, a Bigfoot view of belief in God. And because we cannot demonstrate God's existence in a straightforward manner, that we cannot demonstrate Bigfoot's existence, we just put up instead with something less certain that we call faith, right? And Freud, he says, getting back to this idea that, Freud called it the opiate of the masses, Marx called it the opiate of the masses. He says, Freud also incorrectly saw religion as a mitigation of the harshness of the human condition, which would apparently happen to include such agreeable acts of escapism as being ready to lay down your life for a total stranger, right? Jesus says, pick up your own cross. That's not an opiate. That's actually that's a call to a very, very hard life. There were a huge number of martyrs in the early church. The only authentic image of this God, as Jesus portrayed him, is a tortured and executed political criminal who dies in an act of solidarity with the destitute and dispossessed. Now he says, I'm not necessarily proposing this as true, all this, the New Testament or any religious thing as true, for the excellent reason that it very well may not be. But though the account may not be true, it is not, in his opinion, he says, stupid, vicious, or absurd. Faith, the new atheists seem not to register, is not primarily a belief that something or someone exists, but a commitment and an allegiance to I'll just let
That
that
makes
stay.
sense.
So even our society, as self-assured and as secular as it can be, still has a worldview, and it shows itself in our values. And Karen Armstrong has pointed out, and I'm going to suggest that values are very often a faith construct, because they're very often abstract. And we should ask ourselves, where are we deriving these values from? Free speech, she points out, is a sacred value to us. And even liberal academics who pretend to be staunchly empirical value free inquiry and new knowledge, and we would, we look at China and say, that's sometimes a risk that's pretty risky to the order that we might otherwise maintain. If you value order, you might want to really mitigate certain freedoms, right? So what you value,
What they do, else or none.
yeah, and so what you value shows up, and you maintain it like a faith. And the same poor thinking that causes many people to misunderstand the word theory for science. In science, theory is actually an explanation. And people often say, well, it's just a theory. What they mean is hypothesis, right? The same mistake gets made as mistaking theory for hypothesis when we say faith, meaning ignorance. And that's a really, really bad mistake.
Yeah.
Because Abraham Heschel, I've quoted a number of times, one thing that he points to is that he says the religious person takes the world as not an illusion, but an allusion. That it seems to be pointing to something, because the world is there in evidence, like it's right there in front of you, right? But we take that as an allusion to something that is behind it, that is, the field in which our reality exists, the thing that started that reality. That here's the phenomenon and what produced it, right? It's a metaphysical inquiry into what produces the phenomenon we all experience as being, as reality, right? And we investigate that deeply.
Could be we as icons of God are the illusion of God.
Even right, that's one thing, is that we allude. Yeah. So I'm going to give you guys an example here. Getting to a couple of this is a movie called Grand Budapest Hotel, and it's a wild movie. You'll have to forgive just a bit of the language here, but it's a wild movie, and it's about a guy who is the primary. What would you call it? He's the primary person in charge of all the staff. I wanted to say maitre d', but that's not it. But you know what I'm talking about. He's the primary. He's the head concierge or whatever it is.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, so he at some point loses his job. He's kind of set up and he loses his job, and he ends up he's kind of on the lam. He goes to prison, and then one of his former employees helps him break out, and he asks him, he's like, did you bring me the stuff, like some finer things? But he's just broken out of a prison. He's very proud of his job. He's very proud of whatever, but he's now fired, right? So he's spent so many years at this hotel, and he's trained so many people, and he's very proud, and he has a moment where he's just been broken out of prison. He's not working at the hotel anymore. He's been fired, and this person, his protege, has forgotten to bring something that is actually kind of a luxury item. And he just starts melting down on him, right? But it's interesting how the conversation ends. And so I'll play it for you first. So I don't know how people
I
can
can
see.
listen.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, let's see here. Let me make sure this is turned all the way up. There we go.
That's just marvellous, isn't it? I suppose this is to be expected back in... Where do you come from again?
Excellent, Al-Jabbar.
Precisely. I suppose this is to be expected back in Alexandria, where one's prized possessions are a stack of filthy carpets and a starving goat, and one sleeps behind a tent flap and survives on wild dates and scarabs. But it's not how I trained you. What on God's earth possessed you to leave the homeland where you very obviously belong and travel unspeakable distances to become a penniless immigrant in a refined, highly cultivated society that, quite frankly, could have gotten along very well without you?
The war.
Say again?
Well, you see, my father was murdered, and the rest of my family were executed by firing squad. Our village was burned to the ground, and those who managed to survive were forced to flee. I left because of the war.
I see. So you're actually really more of a refugee in that sense?
Truly.
Well, I suppose I better take back everything I just said. What a bloody idiot I am. Pathetic fool. Goddamn selfish bastard. This is disgraceful and it's beneath the standards of the Grand Budapest. I apologize on behalf of the hotel.
It's not your fault, Mr. Gustav. You were just upset I forgot the
Don't
perfume.
make excuses for me. I owe you my life. You are my dear friend and protege, and I'm very proud of you. You must know that. I'm so sorry, Zero.
When he says, in that context, this is beneath the standards of the Grand Budapest. He's not in the, he doesn't even work there anymore. But this is what we mean when we say, you know, go out at the end of church, like go out into the world and take it with you, right? This idea that it's an investment in a worldview, it's an investment in a, you know, that example where he's like, it doesn't matter where he goes, he carries the Grand Budapest with him, right? He carries those standards. He thinks that hospitality on those on that level, on those according to that standard, it's just life. That's how life ought to be, and this is very much a part of religious faith. Is it's a picture of the world. It's a picture, and it's not really different from ideological beliefs either, right? We're all walking around with a picture of the world as we think it would be improved or better, or the kingdom or utopia or whatever. We're all walking around with it and operating accordingly, right? Now there's another one. There's a last one. That this is where we get to Harry Potter, and this is, we'll sum up here. So, you have you seen or read Harry Potter?
Harry
You have?
Potter, yeah.
Okay.
Kids know.
Oh, you haven't?
After that, they read every
It's
book
really
there is.
good,
Okay.
theological, etc.
So, I'm gonna ruin this for you. Is that okay?
Okay, we'll have to do this for summer reading.
So there's a villain. Well, I'll just start by saying that throughout the entire series, much to the frustration of Harry, Dumbledore are you vaguely familiar with any of the characters at all? Okay. Dumbledore is the headmaster. Dumbledore is the headmaster of Hogwarts, the School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. And he has a relationship with Harry. Harry has this sort of fraught beginnings, right? It's kind of a hero's journey thing. So he's raised by his aunt and uncle because his parents died when he was a baby. He sort of learns gradually the circumstances of that, and there's a bad guy who is
His name
his
should
name should not be spoken. There's a bad guy who at some point, as Harry grows up, there's a link between them, and he has to face him. And so Dumbledore takes special interest in Harry, obviously, to help guide him along. But one of the things that happens is that Dumbledore regularly just talks about love and, you know, its importance, and, you know, meanwhile they're learning magic and all sorts of, and he's wanting, I need a weapon. I need to know how to do. I need a strategy. I need this. I need whatever. I need your help. Can you give me? And he, every so often, he'll just break into talking about love. And there are a bunch of quotes here. You know, from the book that that have to do with Harry and his friends and love and Dumbledore seems to just think that it all hinges on love. And Dumbledore he absolutely did believe that Harry's love for his friends and his family and their love for him would carry a lot of the battle against this evil wizard a long way. But lots of people had problems with this, even people who were friends. They just sometimes started doubting Dumbledore and had just like, oh, I know, but Dumbledore in love and Dumbledore in he puts faith, he puts his trust in the wrong people. But in fact, everything for Dumbledore hinged on one other love. And it was a matter it was an issue that was so unlikely that every person at some point in the series doubts it. Everybody except Dumbledore. And that is that Snape, an apparent villain through the entire series, loved Harry's mother so much that, and Dumbledore, Snape had other compulsions. Snape is one of the teachers at Hogwarts who is really, he's sometimes a very vicious character, and for a lot of the series he presents as the bad guy. He's an immediate sort of foe of Harry's, right? He doesn't like Harry and Harry hates him. A lot of the kids don't like him at all. He had kind of a, he was envious of power. He wanted retribution. You find out that Snape was bullied as a kid, including by Harry's father. He in fact had worked for Voldemort, the ultimate bad guy of the whole series. He had worked for him and had defected. And everybody said, you cannot trust Snape. And partway through the series, he in fact does appear to go back. But in fact, Dumbledore trusted this person everybody else would say don't trust at all. Why would you ever trust him? He trusted him to be a double agent. And the reason is, I said, why should he trust a man with such conflicted emotions to be a reliable double agent? And it's because Dumbledore truly believed that Snape's love for Harry's mother, because he knew her before, as children, he loved her very, very deeply, trumped everything. And in the end, he was proven right. Dumbledore was proven right. And there's this lovely moment, there's a really sad moment. There was a long pause, and slowly Snape regained control of himself, mastering his own breathing. At last he said to Dumbledore, very well, but never, never tell Dumbledore. This must be between us, swear it. I cannot bear, especially Potter's son. I want your word. He says, my word, Severus, that I shall never reveal the best of you. God,
It's so good.
He says, if you insist. And at the end of it, Harry realizes that one of the great heroes of the entire thing was Snape, who sacrifices himself in the end to save Harry. And he's one of the great heroes of the series, and he's presented as a villain the entire time until you realize what's going on at the end. But Dumbledore relied on this, and he had evidence. He had evidence, but everybody else wouldn't believe it. But he trusted in the entire thing and was proven right. And this is another, I think, really, really beautiful example of faith in modern, in contemporary media and contemporary stories. And I think that it's far deeper and far more beautiful than just, you believe in a thing that there's no proof or no evidence for, and you go, yep, I just believe it, and I know that one day God will tell me I'm right. And I think that's a very, very unfortunate and cheap version of faith. And I'm not saying that it's not faith of a sort, but I'm saying there are lots of different pictures of faith. Many of them have a lot to recommend them, and I think that these are some very good ones. And I think that we should actually investigate these things for for as much depth as we can find. And I would say that actually a lot of people who denigrate faith just don't realize they're walking around operating according to many of the same dynamics. We all are. It's like Alexia de Tocqueville said at the beginning. It's actually it's really the rule, not the exception. Most of it. That's just how we function. In the same way that like you can't be plumber and doctor and everything else. There's a guy who was making a wonderful, wonderful argument that said, he said, there's nothing special about religion. And it sounds like he was like, trying to denigrate it, but it wasn't. He basically said, he goes, it's just the nature of the cognitive distribution, like the cognitive division of labor that we all have, that you can't function in society unless, and this was a psychologist who is an atheist himself, but he's like, I just don't think that there's anything unique about religion in terms of how humans function. Like it's a factor, it's an element and it's a dynamic, but at the end of the day, we cannot know all things and we have to invest here, we have to invest there. You cannot but live according to some faith investment all day long.
I was thinking about that the other day when driving. It's like scrolling through YouTube and stuff, they always have these accidents, like, and these near misses where people survive a truck crash or something. But driving, we have faith that people are going to follow the rules, or if they're not going to crash into you. And sometimes I really don't have evidence that everyone's going to do that. I have, I've not had an accident, things like that, but you have to just, like you say, being every single day, you have to act on faith that the massive amount of people driving their cars are not going to crash into you, that they are going to follow the rules to the best of their ability. And I'm thinking, within the medical field, you have faith that the people who are drawing your blood or prescribing medication know what they're talking about, and they're there to help you. There's just all kinds of avenues of life where that's just the case.
I have a ton of evidence, but I have zero proof that gravity won't reverse itself tomorrow.
That's true.
It's like every day of my life, I have, is evidence that it's unlikely to, but I don't have any proof.
God might turn the ON/OFF toggle on gravity.
But so I did.
Let's see if this works.
So that's the end of the material. But did anybody, because we talked about any questions, and we don't have to have any, but if anybody has any questions from the material over the year, or if anybody, does anybody, or even about this.
Are you going to do another Bible study?
We'll certainly talk about some stuff, and I'll certainly participate in some Bible
If you
studies.
have ideas or things you want to have a class on, we're not going to have like a formal class till after Easter.
Yeah.
We're going to do we could do a 4-week thing in May or something.
I thought even a book where like everybody can do the preparation and conversation could happen.
And I'll be gone in May, so maybe you could think of something. I'll be gone for 2 weeks. Thank you.
Yeah, lots of times you can buy books and people can buy the book from you and they're checked and there with answers and questions about each one.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun.
Yeah. Well,
when you talk about value, starting way back in the Old Testament, the value of human life, I think, was really kind of established as far as from God's perspective, because otherwise we probably wouldn't be here. You know what I'm
That's
saying?
true.
So
That could be that's a universal value.
but it's certainly indicated very, very early. If you don't, even if you ignore the Cain and Abel story, which is like your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, right? Even if you ignore that, by the time you get to Noah, the Noahide covenant says, if you spill the blood of another man, your blood, it's like he does not take lightly to the killing of another. Yeah. And it's tricky. People have pointed this out for years that like there seems to be a lot of violence in the Old Testament for that to be true. A lot of it apparently condoned by God. But we also have to factor in that this is, again, a library, and you have to look at these things culturally and understand what they're saying, and just because a thing happened does not necessarily mean that it was really approved of. You know, it's, you
There's
know,
all kinds of smiting going on, and the prophets often will say, God says, go over there and kill all these people.
Yeah.
But it's not God speaking in the Bible. It's a person saying that they're speaking on
Yeah.
behalf of God.
right.
And we hear that even contemporarily, but that also happens in the Bible too.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, I think that's my personal take, is that I think that a lot of people will say, they'll extrapolate from something, you know, like God wants us to survive. God wants us to have the Holy Land. God, these people, you know, these people are a persistent problem for us. He wants us to do what we need to do to survive. So let's kill them all, and God will clearly want that, right? So now the text then reflects their understanding of it. And people have said, like, this is one of the things, Marcion, who was a very early, he's one of the first places that we see anything like a canon, but he was declared a heretic. He left out the entire Old Testament. He's like, I do not recognize that God. That is not a God that I recognize in Jesus.
Yeah, because
And-
he read it.
Yeah,
Literally, but he read it in a different way.
Yeah, but,
it's very gross in some parts.
oh yeah, it's terrible. But it is also, this is Jesus's Bible. Jesus's Bible is the Hebrew Bible. So,
And yet, we're living in gross times.
well,
There is a book we could look at eventually, and it addresses a lot of these parts of the Bible that are, as you say, that are gross parts, and it doesn't redeem those sections, but it helps us understand them and find ways to live with that. Oh, I can't remember the title of it, but I'll bring it in next week.
there are a
and we can
couple
take look.
that come to mind, but
It's a
yeah.
really wonderful book, but it's worth looking at for maybe a longer book study.
Cool. Is there any other questions of stuff that we've covered or from today? All right. Well, thank you guys for participating in this class.
Good one.
Yeah,
It was a good one.
really, very good.